So before you start auditing a client, you must accept that client. Before you say, let me do this, let me maybe do this particular type of engagement, you must accept that client. When you are writing a letter to accept a particular client, we call that engagement letter. The letter that you write to who? To the client to accept that engagement. Engagement letter is part of the planning stage because that is what you are planning. You are planning exactly how you are going to conduct the audit work. So once you have reviewed those particular matters that we had mentioned, we said consider legal, consider practical, consider ethical matters, communicate with the predecessor auditor, or matters of that particular nature. Once you consider those particular matters, it is up to you now to come and write an engagement letter. You can call it engagement letter or a letter of engagement. This, for definition purposes, we can say it is a letter. It is a letter. And this letter is coming from who? From the auditor. It is addressed to who? To the not to the shareholders, but to the management of the company. A letter from auditors or accountants addressed to management or those charged with governance. Those charged with governance. And what is the purpose of this letter? We are acknowledging or we are accepting the acceptance or acknowledgement of that particular engagement. So we can say charged with governance to acknowledge or accept, to acknowledge acceptance of an engagement. An engagement. For this I mean, if today you have agreed with a client that you're going to accept that engagement, do not just accept using verbal words. Go ahead and write a letter, tell him I've acknowledged that one, and from today onwards I'm going to be your auditor. So when you write a letter, you acknowledge. It's like maybe when you're given an employment job, and maybe you have to appreciate that using a letter, to tell them you have appreciated and you acknowledge that one and you're going to do everything according to their what? To their plan. So the rules here are, if you are accepting an engagement, accept using an engagement letter. A letter that accepts an engagement by an auditor. So if you're an auditor and you're accepting an engagement, that's the letter to use. But it's good to know maybe one thing or two about this letter. One of the things is what? The purpose. Why do we need this particular letter? If you ask me, why do I need an engagement letter? I'll tell you, it is the only contract that I've signed with the what? With the client. So you say, it establishes contractual relationship. It establishes a contractual relationship or obligation. Contractual obligation between the auditor and the client. So the only contract between auditor and the client is this letter. You don't have any other contract, and therefore we also refer to it as a contract because it contains terms and conditions. Number two, of this particular purpose, we say it eliminates misunderstanding that may occur in the future audit. Eliminates misunderstanding between the auditor and the what? And the client. So if we cannot agree right now when I'm accepting the engagement, we will never agree when I'm completing the engagement. So why don't we, before we start the audit, we agree on certain things and we eliminate misunderstanding on such particular factors. Number three, this letter educates. We say it educates clients, staff, or clients, shareholders on the role of an auditor. Role of an auditor. If you remember, in our previous class we discussed, or in a previous class, we discussed about what we refer to as it's called a gap, and we had said is an expectation one. Expectations gap will mean that that gap that exists between the user of the financial statement and the auditor himself. And here we say it educates. If you go back to the lesson, you'll find expectations gap bridging is done using engagement letter. And so whatever we discussed in the expectations gap, though we never discussed engagement letter in details because right now is the right time to discuss it, we said to bridge the gap between the user and the auditor on the role of an auditor. That one is supposed to be done using an engagement letter. And that's why we say it educates the clients on the role of an auditor. Now, point number 4 on the purpose is that this letter defines the responsibilities of an auditor. 4, it defines. So have you ever seen where your role has been properly defined? Defines the role, or we can say the scope of the audit. The scope of the audit is to what extent are you, an auditor, supposed to go ahead and perform your responsibility. So that letter can be used for that purposes. In other cases, we say this letter, number 5, if you go to the notes again, you'll find somewhere we wrote about, or maybe where we wrote about, or we discussed about the liability of an auditor. And we said one way to minimize auditor's liability is the use of engagement letter. So we say it eliminates or minimizes. Eliminates, or we say it minimizes auditor's liability. Auditor's liability. This letter has so many other functions. We can go ahead and put another point here. We can say it is from this letter that we can be able to eliminate implied contracts, what we may not want to do for the client. So we say eliminates. Eliminates what? Implied contracts in the audit. Contracts in the audit. That becomes another particular point. As you can see, it's one of the most important letters in auditing because it is the first letter that you write as an auditor to accept an engagement. And talking of acceptance, we can add one more point in number 7, which will read that this letter is the only letter that acknowledges acceptance of an engagement. It acknowledges acceptance of an engagement. So it is only this letter whereby you can be able to know that the auditor really did accept that particular engagement. And because it defines terms and conditions, it establishes a contractual obligation. And because it defines clearly what is your role versus what their role, it eliminates what? Misunderstanding. And because it is able to tell the users of the financial statement what they are supposed to do, then it educates the clients and the users of the financial statement on the work of an auditor. And it also defines, it tells us clearly the role of an auditor and the role of the management. That is the scope. And it can also be used to minimize auditor's liability and to eliminate any contract which you may not be feeling that they are supposed to be done by you, as well as it is the only letter that we use to acknowledge the what? The client as our own client. That is the purpose.